The diner was the kind of place where time seemed to stop, a relic from the past with faded checkered floors, an old jukebox that hadn't played a song in years, and the scent of grease and stale coffee lingering in the air. It was the last stop before the long stretch of desert highway where truckers, drifters, and lost souls passed through, looking for a meal or a moment of quiet. Frank Delaney sat at the counter, nursing his black coffee, his hands weathered from time, veins prominent against his skin. His Marine Corps patch was stitched onto the sleeve of his faded green jacket, the only hint of the life he had lived before. His presence was quiet, just another old man, another forgotten veteran blending into the background. That was how he liked it. Then the bikers rolled in. The Black Vultures, a gang known for raising hell in small towns, came roaring into the parking lot, their Harleys growling like wild dogs. The glass windows trembled from the sheer force of their arrival. Frank didn't turn to look, but he heard them, laughing, shouting, the heavy thud of boots against pavement. A storm was coming. The door slammed open, and in they came, 6 of them, dressed in leather and chains, their presence filling the tiny diner with an ugly energy. The leader, Duke, was a towering man with a thick beard and dead eyes, the kind of eyes Frank had seen too many times in his life, the eyes of a man who enjoyed hurting people. The waitress, a young woman named Annie, stiffened behind the counter. The cook in the kitchen stopped clanging pans. Everyone felt the shift in the air. Duke strode to the counter, grinning as he slapped a heavy ringed hand against it. "Coffee," he said, his voice gravelly. "Black." Annie nodded quickly and turned to pour it, her hands trembling just enough for Frank to notice. The bikers took over the diner in seconds. One flipped a chair over, another grabbed a half-eaten plate of food from a lone trucker and tossed it aside, laughing. Frank kept his eyes on his coffee, pretending not to notice. But then one of them turned toward him. A younger biker, Rat, all tattoos and cheap cologne, sneered as he stepped beside Frank. "What's this?" he mocked. "We got ourselves a real-life war hero?" Frank didn't answer. Rat reached out and flicked the Marine patch on Frank's sleeve. "What war was it, old man? Vietnam? You spend your golden years crying about it?" Duke chuckled, stepping closer. "Don't be rude, Rat. He fought for our freedom." His voice dripped with sarcasm. The bikers laughed. Frank exhaled slowly, placing his coffee cup down. He could feel his pulse slowing, his breathing steadying. Duke leaned in, too close, his breath reeking of whiskey and bad intentions. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" Frank finally turned his head, his eyes meeting Duke's, and for a second, just a second, Duke hesitated. There was nothing in Frank's eyes, no fear, no anger, just a void. Duke hated that. He shoved Frank. The stool rocked, and Frank felt his back hit the counter. Not hard, but hard enough. He let it happen. The diner was silent. Annie gasped, but she didn't move. The trucker in the corner tensed, but he knew better than to interfere. This was the moment where most people would beg or back down. Frank did neither. Duke grinned. "You ain't got nothing to say?" Frank wiped the coffee from his sleeve, completely calm. "You done?" he asked, his voice even. Duke's grin faltered. He expected fear. What he got was indifference. "Maybe I ain't," Duke said, his tone darker now. "Maybe I—" The bell above the diner door jingled as Frank stood up. Not in a rush. Not like a man running from a fight. Like a man making a decision. The bikers watched him, laughing as he walked toward the exit. "Yeah, that's right," Rat jeered. "Take a hike, old-timer." Frank paused at the door. "Coffee was good," he said simply. Then he stepped outside. Duke chuckled and waved to his men. "Come on, boys, let's send our veteran off properly." The bikers followed him out. Annie's breath hitched. She turned to the trucker, eyes wide. "They're gonna kill him." The trucker, a man who had seen enough in life to recognize real danger, swallowed thickly and shook his head. "No," he muttered. "They're gonna wish they never met him." The heat outside was thick and heavy, the kind that clung to the skin like an invisible second layer. The sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows across the diner parking lot, stretching over the cracked pavement, swallowing the spaces between the motorcycles lined up in a crooked row. The smell of exhaust and stale beer lingered in the air as Frank Delaney stepped into the fading light, rolling his shoulders, stretching the stiffness from his joints. Behind him, the door to the diner creaked open, and the bikers spilled out, laughing, loud, full of the false confidence of men who had never had to fight for their lives. Duke was the last to step outside, rolling his thick shoulders as he cracked his knuckles. He looked at Frank like a cat watching a half-dead mouse, convinced there wasn't a fight left in him. "You got a bad habit of running your mouth, old man," Duke said, his voice carrying in the stillness of the highway. "Maybe I ought to break you in, teach you some respect." Frank stood there, letting them circle around him like a pack of coyotes, his face unreadable. He glanced over at his truck, parked just a few feet away. 4 slashed tires. They didn't just want to rough him up. They wanted him stranded, helpless. Duke took a step closer. "Ain't gonna beg?" Frank exhaled, slow and steady. "I don't beg," he said simply. Duke's grin widened. "Yeah, you will." The first hit came fast, a sucker punch from Rat aimed right for Frank's ribs. Except Frank wasn't there when the fist landed. He moved in a way that no old man should move, shifting just enough that the punch whiffed through empty air. Rat stumbled forward, off balance, and before he could recover, Frank snapped his elbow backward, right into Rat's nose. A sickening crack echoed through the parking lot as Rat collapsed onto the pavement, blood streaming down his face. He screamed, clutching his shattered nose, his boots kicking against the gravel. Everything went still. Duke's smirk flickered, then vanished completely. Frank straightened, rolling his shoulders like he was just getting warmed up. "Still think I'm an easy target?" he asked, his voice almost conversational. The bikers hesitated. They had expected a weak old man. They had made a mistake. Duke's nostrils flared and then he lunged. He was fast for a man his size, but Frank was faster. The years hadn't dulled his instincts. They had sharpened them. Frank sidestepped at the last second, grabbing Duke's wrist and using his own momentum against him. A twist, a step, and Duke was suddenly airborne, his entire body flipping over before slamming onto the ground with a heavy thud. Before the others could react, Frank was already moving. One of the bikers reached for a knife. Frank caught his wrist mid-draw, twisting it with a precision that sent the blade clattering onto the pavement. A quick, brutal strike to the throat sent the man to his knees, gasping for air. Another lunged at him from behind. Frank pivoted and drove his elbow into the man's sternum, sending him sprawling against the hood of a bike. The force of the impact set off the alarm, a shrill wail that cut through the silence of the desert. Duke groaned, pushing himself up, his face twisted with rage. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled a switchblade, flicking it open with a metallic snap. "You don't walk away from this," he spat. Frank just tilted his head. "I walked away from worse." Duke rushed him. Frank didn't retreat. He stepped into the attack, catching Duke's wrist mid-swing. His other hand shot forward, striking Duke's elbow at just the right angle. A sickening pop followed as the biker howled in agony, his wrist now twisted in a way it shouldn't be. The knife dropped from his fingers. Frank caught it before it hit the ground. For the first time that night, Duke's eyes filled with fear. Frank stepped closer, flipping the blade in his hand, letting the weight settle. He stared at Duke, then at the other bikers who were still conscious. "You boys made 2 mistakes tonight," Frank said, his voice low, even. He gestured toward his truck. "First, you messed with a man who wasn't looking for trouble." Then he drove the knife into the wooden post beside them, burying it deep. The sharp clang of metal meeting wood made the remaining bikers flinch. "The second," Frank continued, "is thinking I'm done." Duke stumbled back, clutching his broken arm. Rat was still groaning on the ground, his face a mess of blood. The others didn't move, didn't speak. The fight had been ripped out of them. Frank turned away like they weren't even worth his time anymore. He started toward the diner, pausing only once. "Fix my tires," he said, without looking back. No one argued. The night air had turned thick with the scent of blood and gasoline. The ringing alarm from the bike echoed through the empty highway, a siren calling out into the dark. The fight should have been over, but Frank Delaney knew better. He could feel it, the rage radiating off Duke, the stubborn defiance of a man who had never been bested. The other bikers were broken, bruised, some of them barely able to stand. But Duke? He wasn't done yet. Frank walked toward the diner, slow, deliberate, giving them a chance to make the right choice, to fix his tires and disappear. But men like Duke never learned. Behind him, the heavy crunch of boots against gravel made Frank stop. He turned slightly, catching the reflection in the diner window. Duke was coming. His broken arm hung limply at his side, his breath coming in ragged bursts, but the hatred in his eyes burned hot. "You think this is done?" Duke growled. Frank sighed, turning fully. "It could have been." Duke spat blood onto the pavement, his nostrils flaring. "You don't get to walk away from this." His good hand slipped behind his back, and Frank caught the unmistakable glint of a gun. The moment stretched long and thin. Frank's expression didn't change, didn't flinch, but his body tensed, not in fear, but in calculation. His mind slowed everything down to a crawl, the weight of Duke's stance, the way his fingers curled around the grip, the slight shake in his wrist from the adrenaline still flooding his system. The gun started to rise. Frank moved. Before Duke could even level the barrel, Frank was already on him. He stepped forward, one quick, brutal motion, his left hand shooting out, gripping Duke's wrist with an iron grip. He twisted, hard, forcing the biker's arm out and away. The gun fired, a deafening crack splitting the night, the round disappearing into the open desert. Frank didn't stop. He drove his knee into Duke's ribs, a sickening crunch beneath his denim jacket. Duke gasped, stumbling, but Frank didn't let go. He twisted Duke's wrist again, this time harder, bone and tendon giving way under the pressure. The pistol dropped, clattering onto the pavement. Duke barely had time to react before Frank's fist smashed into his jaw. The biker went down hard, his back slamming against the cracked pavement. He wheezed, coughing blood, his body convulsing with the sheer force of the impact. Silence fell over the parking lot. The remaining bikers didn't move. No one went for the gun. No one tried to help their leader. Frank stood over Duke, staring down at him with the same cold, measured look he had carried through war zones, through jungles, through places these bikers would never even dream of surviving. He leaned down, his voice low, calm. "You think you're some kind of tough guy," Frank murmured, "but you don't know what tough is." Duke tried to respond, but only a choked wheeze escaped his lips. Frank reached down and picked up the pistol. He studied it for a moment, feeling the weight in his palm. It was a cheap, dirty thing, a weapon carried by men who relied on fear instead of skill. He ejected the magazine, pulled back the slide, and tossed the gun into the desert. Then he stood, taking a slow step back, surveying what was left of the black vultures. "You boys want to end up like him?" he asked. No one answered. Frank exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the weight of the years pressing down on him again. "Then get him up, get on your bikes, and ride the hell out of my town." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Rat, still clutching his broken nose, staggered to Duke's side. One by one, the bikers did the same, dragging their beaten leader to his feet, holding him up like a man barely clinging to life. Frank watched as they stumbled toward their bikes, their bravado completely shattered. One of them, a younger guy with nervous eyes, probably new to the gang, hesitated as he climbed onto his ride. He looked at Frank, swallowing hard. "Who the hell are you?" Frank let the question hang in the air before answering. "Just a guy who wanted to drink his coffee in peace." The biker nodded once, as if that somehow made it all click in his head. Then the engines roared back to life, and one by one, the black vultures rode out into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Frank stood there, hands on his hips, listening to the sound of the rumbling engines fade. He let out a slow breath, rolling the stiffness from his neck. His hands still ached, his knuckles sore from the fight, but he felt good. Alive. The diner door creaked open behind him. Annie stepped out, eyes wide, staring at the empty parking lot. "They gone?" she asked, voice small. Frank nodded. The trucker inside let out a low whistle. "Jesus, old man, where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" Frank smirked, adjusting his jacket. "A long time ago." Annie crossed her arms, exhaling sharply. "Well, I hope it was worth it. You scared off half my business, wrecked my parking lot, and..." She pointed at his truck. "Your tires are still slashed." Frank turned, staring at his useless tires. He sighed. "Damn." Annie shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Come on, I'll call Leo. He's got a tow truck and he owes me a favor." Frank hesitated for a second, then nodded. "I could use a refill on that coffee too." She rolled her eyes, but motioned for him to follow. As Frank walked back toward the diner, the night finally settling into calm, he couldn't help but smile. It was a good fight, And tomorrow? Tomorrow, he'd just have his coffee in peace. The hum of the diner's neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting long, wavering shadows over the cracked asphalt. The night had finally settled into an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional gust of wind that kicked up dust along the roadside. The black vultures were long gone, their taillights vanishing into the vast stretch of desert highway. Frank Delaney sat back down at the diner counter, his fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, the same coffee he had been drinking before the trouble started. The moment felt oddly full circle, like the universe had briefly tilted off its axis, but had finally set itself right again. Annie placed a fresh plate in front of him, eggs, toast, and bacon, the kind of meal that sticks to the ribs. He hadn't asked for it, but she had brought it anyway, her silent way of saying thanks. "You eat for free tonight," she muttered, arms crossed, trying to sound indifferent but failing miserably. "Not that you earned it. I had to mop blood off my damn floor." Frank chuckled, taking a bite of toast. "Appreciate it." The trucker at the far booth, a burly man with a gut that spoke of a lifetime behind the wheel, leaned forward, shaking his head. "That was the damnedest thing I ever saw," he said. "Thought for sure those bastards were going to put you in the ground." Frank took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "They thought the same thing." The trucker whistled, tapping the rim of his own coffee mug. "Guess they thought wrong." The door jingled, and Leo, the town's only tow truck driver, strolled in, dusting off his hands. He was a stocky man in his late 50s, with grease-streaked overalls and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He took one look at Frank, then at Annie, then sighed. "Heard you got yourself into a mess," Leo muttered, tossing his keys onto the counter. Annie snorted. "That's an understatement." Leo turned to Frank, eyeing him up like he was seeing him for the first time. "You really do all that to those bikers?" Frank just shrugged. They had it coming. Leo shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "Damn. Well, I got your truck jacked up. Got some spare tires in my shop. I'll have you rolling again in an hour." Frank nodded in thanks. "I owe you." Leo grunted. Yeah, just don't get into any more fights before sunup." Frank smirked but said nothing. As Leo went back outside, the trucker leaned in, lowering his voice. "You really ain't afraid of those guys coming back?" Frank set his coffee down, staring at the dark reflection of himself in the window. The truth was, he wasn't afraid. He had been afraid once, a long time ago, in places far worse than this. But fear had burned out of him, leaving behind something colder, something harder. "They won't be back," Frank said simply. The trucker frowned. "You sound real sure of that." Frank nodded. "Because men like Duke, they don't like losing. He's got two choices now. He can come back, looking for revenge, in which case, I'll put him in the ground. Or..." He took another slow sip of coffee, letting the weight of his words settle in. "Or he takes the beating, learns his lesson, and realizes he's not the toughest man walking." The trucker studied him for a long moment. "And if he picks the first option..." Frank sighed, setting his mug down. "Then we finish what we started." The trucker exhaled, shaking his head. "Damn, old man, you got ice in your veins." Frank didn't argue. The diner fell into silence again, the tension easing, the world returning to what it had been before the black vultures rode in. Outside, the desert stretched on forever, an empty road leading into the unknown. Frank finished his meal, wiped his hands on a napkin, and stood. His body ached, not from pain, but from the years, from the weight of too many battles fought, too many wars that never really ended. He dropped a few bills on the counter, ignoring Annie's protests about the free meal, and made his way to the door. As he stepped outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dust and asphalt. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air settle into his lungs. The night was still, quiet, peaceful. He liked it that way. He climbed into his truck, the new tires sturdy beneath him, and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, steady, reliable, just like him. As he pulled onto the highway, leaving the diner behind, he didn't look back. There was nothing back there worth remembering, only a fight that had ended, and a warning that had been sent.